Hi, everyone. I'm Kirsten Davidson, your host and creator of my wellness podcast, Mind the Gaps, surrendering our typical ways of looking at life to step out of our comfort zone and into our growth zone. Welcome to episode number 16, When Psychology Meets Philosophy, where I'm joined by author Johnny Thompson, coming to us virtually all the way from the United Kingdom to talk about all things philosophy. Johnny Thompson is a public philosopher and runs the social media account Mini Philosophy, which you can find on Instagram at Philosophy Minis, a community of 500,000 across 3 platforms. He's the best-selling author of 3 books, Mini Philosophy, Mini Big Ideas, and his latest this summer, Mini Psychology. Before he turned to writing full-time, Johnny taught philosophy in Oxford for 10 years. Johnny lives in North Oxfordshire in England with his wife, 2 young sons, and an aggressively fecund apple tree, as described by him. I thought I'd take a moment to share how this episode came to be. In 2021, I was drawn to a little blue book at Indigo called Mini Philosophy, which, after reading cover to cover, earned its way onto my living room coffee table, where it would sit between the sleeves of some other favorite books of mine for the next 2 years. Fast forward to a rainy morning in the spring of 2024 after I'd launched this podcast. I was sat on my couch daydreaming, and that little blue book looked back at me. I pulled it out and noticed that the cover had the same color scheme as Mind the Gaps, and even a little stick figure man sitting and pondering life with a thought bubble. Before I could talk myself out of it, I was messaging the author on Instagram telling him about Mind the Gaps, my love for philosophy, our twin logos, and inviting him to be on the podcast. I figured it was a long shot, but what the hell, right? Nothing to lose. Hours later, Johnny Thompson from Oxfordshire, the author of that little blue book on my coffee table, accepted my invite. And that brings us to today. Who'd have thought I'd get to chat with one of my favorite authors about the nature of existence, and on my own podcast too. So thank you, Johnny, for doing me the honor. For all things Mind the Gaps, you can find me on Instagram at kirsten.davidson. I'm happy to answer every single one of your questions, comments, or feedback, and most of all, I'm happy to have you as part of the Mind the Gaps community. If you're interested in booking a therapy session with me, please feel invited to email me at kirsten@mindthegaps.co. You can also schedule a session online through the link found on all of my social media platforms. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, Johnny. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. Looking forward to it.
I started off today's episode by asking Johnny if he could share his journey of becoming an author.
Well, it's a case of kind of ending up somewhere you never saw coming, really, because I used to be a teacher, and this was about 3 or 4 years ago. And I, as all teachers do, you build up this kind of like this body of resources, and I was having these kind of little cool pictures on my PowerPoints, and I'd obviously have like these revision packs or these revision notes for my students. And I thought, okay, why not put these on the internet? Why not kind of like see how they go down? And so I originally uploaded a few images and captions to Tumblr back in the day. And I don't think Tumblr's as big as it was possibly when I started. And they did quite well. So I got a few thousand followers on there, and I decided then to kind of move it across to some of the bigger platforms like Instagram. And so that's when I set up the Mini Philosophy Instagram account, where I would have an image, a static picture, and then I would have a caption, which is by limit, no more than 2,200 characters. And so what I didn't realize actually, I was learning the art of how to condense these ideas into very small nuggets, which were also engaging and accessible. And so I did that for about 2 or 3 years, and luckily enough, it seemed to be quite popular. I kind of built up a bit of a following there. And so what I did then was that I picked the 10 or the 15 best ones, and I put them into a package and then sent it to loads of book agents. I thought this might be a really good idea for a book. And luckily, the next day, my now agent, Charlie Brotherstone, emailed me back saying, I think it's a really good idea. And we worked on a proposal. We condensed it all together, and then we sent it all out to some publishers. And again, luckily, some publishers liked it. And I eventually settled on my current publisher, which is Wildfire, which is part of the Hachette publishing group. And then Mini Philosophy did well. It sold in 21 countries as we speak, which is still surreal to me. I've got on my bookshelf up here, so what happens when you're an author is you get sent like loads of free copies of your book, and it's great. You get in the original English. I think I got 12 originally, and then but also every international publication is meant to send you a book. I'm not sure they all did. I definitely haven't got 21 up here, but I've got Korean, I've got Portuguese, I've got Polish, I've got like simple Chinese and complex Chinese. So it's bizarre seeing my words like translated across the world.
Wow.
And then so then it kind of like blew up from there. And in part of the kind of the promo part of the book, I kind of like wrote for a few publications, say, look, I'll write an article in return for plugging my book. And one of those was Big Think. So eventually I was working for them, freelance for a couple of years, and then had an opportunity last year where they said, do you want to come on board full time? And I said, yeah, definitely take it. And that's where I am now. I'm a writer, I'm a journalist, and I run the Mini Philosophy Instagram accounts. My formal education was in philosophy. So I kind of taught religious studies, I taught philosophy, and I taught also ended up being politics and global politics at the end.
What a combination.
Yeah. I mean, they're all kind of that kind of humanities essay kind of like area. I quite like politics, but I've now returned to my philosophical roots, although psychology is in there in the background too.
Yes, your newest book.
Yeah, Mini Psychology, out in 5 days' time. So I'm on the plugging it circuit at the moment. So all your readers should definitely go out and buy it right now.
Yes, by the time this is out, by the time you are hearing this, the book will be out and on shelves. So that's very exciting. Before diving into any specific philosophical theories today, I asked Johnny how he would describe what philosophy is exactly.
Most philosophers have different answers, and the question itself is a philosophical debate. But the etymology of it is the love of wisdom, philosophia. So the idea is that you're just loving learning, essentially. And I kind of have sympathy for that kind of very broad understanding of philosophy. There's Mary Midgley, who's a philosopher. She often talks about an example of someone she once knew called the philosopher. Everyone in the neighborhood called this person the philosopher. And she once got to meet this guy, and he was behind a desk, and they were just having a chat. And it was a windy day, and there was a tree outside in his garden, and it was about to tip from the wind. And this philosopher, he just stopped what he was doing. He stopped talking. He stopped interacting, and he looked out of the window, and he just couldn't stop looking at the tree to see which way it would fall. He was just like desperately curious, this kind of like compulsion to see what happened. And I think Mary Midgley said that's what made him the philosopher. That need to know, that curiosity. And the ancient Greeks had a word called thauma. Which is this idea of it's kind of this wonder or marvel or curiosity. And when I describe it, I often talk about like young children are very good at this. They have this kind of sense of awe. So like a young child can just sit in a garden and watch an ant for ages because it's an amazing thing. But it could be anything. It could be looking at the stars. It could be learning about DNA. It could be learning about maths. And I mean, a lot of people have this kind of thauma, and I think that thauma, and Aristotle does say this, is that it's the start of all philosophy. That need to know, that curiosity, wanting to know and wanting to learn. And that's what I think philosophy is. And it's such a broad definition because every subject has it. Physics, biology, mathematics, there's all an element of it. All of those subjects do have a philosophy of them. So there is a philosophy of maths, there's a philosophy of science, there's a philosophy of religion, whatever. So I'm happy to say that philosophy is kind of just awe and wonder and that need, that compulsion to know the answer, even if you don't find the answer, which is very important because often you don't find the answer.
I like that you tie in awe because that's so important in talking about young children and how they look at the world in awe. And I talk about that a lot on how we want to just tune back into that childlike wonder of the world so that we can get excited about what's going to happen today and stop and pay more attention to the otherwise mundane tasks or mundane activities because there is awe to be found everywhere. But when we get lost in, we'll say maybe like non-philosophical thinking, we're just going through the motions. So I think it is really important to keep that frame of mind as often as we can.
No, I absolutely agree. That childlike curiosity it's really important. I think it's also motivational, isn't it? Like if most academic subjects require a lot of hard work. They require a lot of kind of like, late nights in the library, early starts and, cranking out essays and doing research projects. It's hard to do that unless you're motivated. And if you're not motivated by money or power or kind of love, what are you motivated for? And I think thauma is a great motivation, just a sheer curiosity of something. That's what motivates me. I think it motivates a lot of academics. And I find it quite sad if people don't have that need to know.
After reading Johnny's book, Mini Philosophy, the Little Blue Book, I made note of some of my favorite chapters and subjects, which he graciously expands on here in our chat. So, one of my favorite philosophical theories that you reference in your book is Plato's allegory of the cave. Would you mind explaining to listeners what that is and maybe how that relates to modern day?
Sure, yeah, it's a great allegory because it feeds so well into so many modern stories.
Hmm.
Alice in Wonderland, The Matrix, The Truman Show, anything which essentially, asks you what is the reality behind what seems to be the case.
Hmm.
So the basic setup is that Plato imagines that there's a group of people who are in a cave, very dark, Stygian, kind of like dank cave. And they are chained and they're facing a wall. And on the wall there's shadow, what we call like a shadow puppetry, basically, it's like shadow theatre. Because there's a fire behind them, and there are people who are dragging across like different objects, like let's say like a wooden cutout of a dog, which then a fire then hits, and of course causes the shadow of a dog on the wall.
Hmm.
Now these people are born into this condition, and they're facing the wall, and of course the shadows are all they know, and so they become very good at identifying shadows. They know all different types of dogs, they can tell all the outlines and stuff, and they are shadow experts. Now one day, one of the prisoners breaks free. We don't know why or don't know how, but they run out of the cave, and then they run upstairs out of the cave, and they're blinded by this dazzling sun. It's incredibly, as it would be. If you turn on the lights in the morning after waking up out of bed, it's bright. And then they're amazed by the wonder of the world. It's beautiful. There's nature, there's trees, there's the breeze on the face. It's glorious. And so interestingly, they could do two things. Then they could either just go out into the world, couldn't you? And you could just live your life and have a great time and ignore the people in the cave. But what this person does do is they go back into the cave to try to help their old friends. And when this person goes back into the cave, there are two things happen. The first is that they, of course, no longer can see the shadows as well. Their eyes are blinded, and it's very kind of like hard to discern the shadows. And so the people mock them. They say, look at you. You're not good at identifying shadows. You're an idiot. You're a moron. You get out of here. And the second thing is they don't want to leave. So the person who's left the cave said, look, there's this bright, brilliant, beautiful world out there that if only you left the cave, you'd see and try to leave, and they won't believe them. It's a great metaphor. And on a very basic level, or it kind of seems like it's a religious metaphor, isn't it? That the world is the cave and going outside is some kind of heaven. And in fact, Plato was very popular with the early Christian fathers, church fathers, particularly Augustine, for example, and because, it links very well with Christianity, this idea that the world is some kind of slightly corrupted, dim, shadowy place, whereas the real world is heaven. And so spend all of your time trying to embrace the heaven. But it also has kind of like epistemological, which is to do with knowledge implications. The idea is that there are truths that we can know about the world, particularly for Plato, about justice and truth and goodness. And we can work them out if we reflect enough. And so the philosopher's journey is leaving the cave. It's kind of like trying to abandon all the distractions of the world, booze, sex, even friendships, like jobs and stuff like that. All of these things are distractions from ultimately contemplation and the cave. And so it can be interpreted lots of different ways like that. And when Plato talked about it in Republic, it kind of ties into his politics a little bit. Plato talks about this idea of the philosopher kings.
Yeah.
And these are people who are so wise from contemplating, and they know what justice is and goodness is and fairness is. Even if they don't know them perfectly, they might know them better than most people. So those are the people who are best qualified to lead and to rule. And the philosopher kings are the people who've obviously left the cave. They have seen the light, and they're trying to bring the light back to the people in the cave. And they're often killed. Socrates was Plato's teacher and friend. He was killed by the Athenian democracy. It's hard not to read that biographical detail into the cave, because Socrates is this person who's enlightened, and yet he was killed by the people of Athens.
As you're saying all this, I'm realizing that, yes, I've heard the allegory many, many times, but this time, the way you said it was this realization of, in Mind the Gaps, we have our comfort zone and we have our growth zone, which I represent as a train station platform in England. Mind the Gaps, that's where the whole subway station analogy comes from. The platform is our comfort zone. The train is our growth zone. The gap is that space in between, that kind of the unexamined space. So this whole podcast is about examining the unexamined. And so thinking of it in terms of the cave, it's like the cave itself is the comfort zone, and the outside world where it's sunny and bright is the growth zone.
And that's the philosopher's journey, isn't it, as well? And of course, it's a psychotherapist journey nowadays, isn't it? I think. I think the big difference between the psychotherapist and the philosopher, at least in the Plato metaphor, is that, the Plato, we're reaching out into this kind of like abstracted world of forms and truth. Whereas I think the psychotherapist, or even maybe the counselor and the psychologist, is going inside the cave to find some truth there as well, isn't there? I mean, ultimately, Plato thinks the two are the same, because Plato believes that we are ensouled with something, that there is truth within us. So if we reflect and contemplate and introspect, we will find the same truth which is true in the universe. But I
Yeah.
think today, if you don't even but sign up to that kind of slightly religious, spiritual association, I think reflection, introspection can reveal great truth.
No, it's a good point. Looking inwards to
Mm.
make better sense of stuff going on outwardly.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where philosophy and psychotherapy I found always really complemented each
Mm.
other in my studies because I took philosophy all throughout high school and university every year, and I found that it really helped me understand psychological concepts differently.
Yes. Yeah, and I tell you what, I'm a philosopher, and I don't want to be a cliche and completely say that the Greeks were amazing. But you go back to these ancient texts, and you realise that a lot of the stuff which has come after was actually found in these early kind of like classical texts. Aristotle, Plato, and some of the Stoics were amazing. And I think with psychology, if you go back, you can see a lot of that in the ancient Greeks as well.
That's interesting. That's interesting to tie it back to the historical origin and how there is that overlap. And I think, unfortunately, psychology got a rap of being more clinical, and
Yeah.
psychotherapy takes it a bit closer to that holistic model, which does invite more critical thinking and more philosophical thinking, because the
Yeah.
very hard science of clinical psychology, as I talk about in a previous episode on diagnostics, where I kind of challenge the whole diagnostics model, is we get too comfortable trying to put people into boxes and thinking that that's it. Okay, we've labeled them, that's it, we're good. But that's quite the opposite of
Mm.
philosophical thinking or creative thinking, because we're just acting as if we know, and then there's no more exploration to be had. Whereas acknowledging the ambiguity and the million, billion, trillion different things that impact someone's psychology, that's more philosophical thinking and less
Mm.
medical model, clinical black and white thinking.
Yeah, no, I find that really interesting as well. And I guess in a way, psychology has a problem that it's a city which is occupied over two countries, isn't it? Really, in one way, there's the behavioural element of it that you can see and you can witness and you can monitor. You can either on the brain or literally in how people are behaving.
Mm-hmm.
But then if you only focus on that, you miss out the other big kind of phenomenological part of it, which is what it feels like to have thoughts and what it feels like to have minds and stuff like that. And it's hard to kind of marry the two. What's going on in your head right now? That's clearly psychology. But
Mm-hmm.
how can we talk about that? How can we measure that? How can we do any kind of like repeatable experiments on your thoughts? You can't. But to exclude that from psychology would be to massively impoverish the discipline,
Yeah.
I would argue.
All right. So let's dive into the easy topic of free will.
Oh yeah, we will.
In your book, you share John Buridan's take on the subject. Would you mind explaining his take? And I'd love to hear your own perspective on free will as well.
Wow. Okay. Wow. Two big questions. Yeah. It's a Buridan's ass or donkey. Suppose there's a donkey, and it's both hungry and thirsty, and it has on its left-hand side a hay bale and has on its right-hand side a pail of water. All things being equal, there's no reason to suppose one over the other. Which would the donkey choose? Because it has two competing motivations, and there's no reason to choose one or the other. And what Buridan suggests is that eventually it'll have to some kind of like innate instinct will kick in to choose either the hay bale or the pail. If our free choices are completely determined by our natural brain wiring or our environment, neither of those are within our control. Genetically, we're made a certain way and our brain develops in the womb and then we're born. Boom. Then the environment makes us. At no point in that scenario is there kind of free will. Where do you come in?
Mm-hmm.
Or presenting it in a kind of like a more in the physics kind of manner, like Newtonian physics, is the idea that if the universe is essentially one big billiard table, atoms are hitting atoms and everything is governed by the laws of nature, nothing can be chosen because everything I've done is up to now is because of the cause and effect of my past.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe my dad played jazz when I was growing up, and so therefore I like jazz, and therefore I now every time I listen to jazz it makes me feel good, and every time I feel good, whatever. Essentially, the idea is that you can trace your entire mental path back, and therefore you can probably explain what's going to happen now. And that's called Laplace's demon. It's another thought experiment where he says, imagine there is a demon of infinite intelligence, omniscience, and you've programmed into him the entire way the universe is right now. So all of the collection of atoms where every atom is in the universe. And also you program into all of the absolute laws of nature. Given those two facts, this demon could predict anything that's going to happen. He could tell you everything about you. And of course, this is God, isn't it? In a lot of monotheists will say this is what God would know. So therefore, there can't be any free will. Now, what's my answer to the question of free will? Presented from that position, yeah, I don't think from the God's eye view and from the laws of physics and science, it does seem difficult how we can justify free will. That either I am my brain which is biologically produced for me by my mum and my dad, and biology, or the environment which has happened to me. I don't provide anything to that. Is it random? That wouldn't be free will either. But most people feel like they have free will. And I don't think it's necessarily inconsistent to say that free will is what I want to do, even if I couldn't have done otherwise. And this is called soft determinism. It's kind of a compatibilist position. And my philosophical positions on most things are very much on the fence. And compatibilism about the free will issue is on the fence. It's kind of saying that, my free choice is because I want to. So if I reach for this slice of pizza over that slice of pizza, it's because I want it. It's not a free choice in the sense that I could have chosen any other pizza. I was always going to choose that pizza in this universe. But I wanted to do it. And wants are determined by my biology, their hormones, their synapses in the brain. And that's all we have. Some people don't like the idea that we could not have done otherwise, that if you went back in time, I would always do the same thing. But I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the idea that I'm doing what I want most of the time. So, what do you think? What are your views about free will?
Yeah, it's very complicated, right? There's so many different ways to approach it. I was just listening to something by Sam Harris, neuroscientist and philosopher, and his take on free will is there is absolutely no free will, which I would agree with the whole cause and effect argument. There is no room for us to act outside of our being. If our being is produced by cause and effect, there's no. Right.
I mean, either. What are the options? So either it's random chance, in which case, it's not your choice because it's random. Going back to the Buridan's ass, the donkey randomly chooses one pail over the hay. That's not free will. That's random still. Or it's the product of your brain, which is telling you to do something. Again, not random. It's just it's biological and it's nature nurture combination. Either way, there's no you in that combination. Or it's what? I mean, it's God, it's divine forces, possibly. So the only way I think you can plausibly defend any kind of like free will position these days is to wallow in mystery a little bit. I mean, there is this quantum science where there is this whole world of quantum physics and uncertainty, which we don't know about. And some people claim that because there is quantum randomness, free will might be hidden in there somewhere, and we'll find that one day. Fair enough. Maybe we will. But that's an article of faith, I think. And also dualism. This is the idea that that we have these thoughts which are separate to our body. Again, it's hard to justify that without some kind of religious belief these days. I would say it's so contrary to all of the scientific theories we have. It has to retreat into faith. But then I think if you believe in dualism, which idea that we have minds and we have bodies and they're very different things, then you have to account for how the two interact, how the two work together. And they do interact, they do work together. At least it seems to be so. So essentially, I'm just throwing out more mysteries at you. But I mean, so the only way that free will might exist is as an act of faith, I think, in the way that Sam Harris talks about. But the way I'm talking about it in terms of free will is redefined as doing what you want. And those wants are determined by your brain and your hormones and your reactions in your head.
That's a really good way to rectify the fear that a lot of people experience when you say we might not have free will or we don't have free will, because it seems to evoke this really uncomfortable feeling in a lot of people of like, well, what do you mean? I thought I chose this. I thought I wanted this. And the way you're saying it is you can still do things you want, but what you want has been determined by your conditioning, by your experiences. And that's okay, because we still get to do things we want to do, but it's been determined. And I use this example when I'm talking with clients about people in their life that they really dislike, or people in the world that they really dislike. And they'll say, if I was them, I would have done it differently. And if I was them, I wouldn't have done that. Or how could they do that? And then I tend to push for exploration of, well, what might have led someone to kill a bunch of people, right?
Yes.
What might have led someone to do that? And that's not an excuse. And that person would still need to take accountability, and we'd still need to contain them. Like I joke, I can understand why that person might do something, say because of traumas in their upbringing, or these beliefs that have been solidified by other indoctrinations from people who have the same traumas or different traumas that have led them to hold these maladaptive beliefs that lead them to do bad things or hurtful things. We can understand all that, but I wouldn't invite them to dinner. I'm not going to open my world up to that person, and they would still need to take accountability, but we can understand why. So I guess what I'm getting at right
Yeah.
now goes into the justice system, because a lot of people will jump to, well, if free will doesn't exist, how can we punish people? We still would need to contain and reteach, recondition,
Yeah.
even
Well,
though how they made those decisions would have been predetermined.
exactly. Yeah. No, I agree with you. And what you've said there opens up a whole lots of other cans of worms as well in terms of like what is accountability. And you said
Mhm.
that they do have responsibility. I mean, sometimes they don't. We have this definition of clinical insanity, don't we, or criminal insanity, where people are tried not as being moral agents but as being insane. And it's not a binary. It's not a you are insane, you're not insane. There clearly comes a point where someone's trauma, as you mentioned earlier, or their upbringing, is so horrible, so kind of like crippling, that we do say that they aren't morally culpable for their actions because they are essentially broken by the world. But
Mhm.
of course, as I say, that's not a binary. So but everyone has some kind of degree of that. And where does moral responsibility come in? That's, as I say, a question for the law courts. At least in the British justice system, we do give a lot of leeway to individual judges to make decisions on that as well. They'll look at individual cases and they'll determine that, for example, let's say, an 18-year-old boy who's had a very kind of like hard life, traumatic life, and only led into one kind of, let's say, a horrible gang culture.
Mhm.
They are, they're maybe possibly less morally to blame than someone who has had better opportunities presented to them, or different alternatives. I think we do, and it's up to the judge's discretion to make that choice.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's no easy question. And of course, lurking behind this might be something called what Plato called a noble lie, that maybe we just have to pretend that we have free will, because
Mm.
what else can we do? That's how society has to function.
If we could live in a different utopian universe, that we wouldn't
Yeah.
even necessarily be blaming the criminals, it would be, there would still be consequences. Like there would still need to be some type of containment, but more containment and rehabilitation, because beyond the definition of clinically insane, what about someone who has just hurt someone because they've been hurt? That still doesn't excuse their behavior. It does provide reasoning and it does give room for self-improvement. So technically, I personally believe that everyone who hurts someone has been hurt themselves and has room for healing. So in a perfect world, the people that hurt would be given opportunity for healing.
Oh, I agree. I do agree with you. And I agree with you also more, I think, since I've had children myself, that
Mm.
actually, like I think if you spend any time around very young children, like talking about babies or even like, 1 or 2 year old and stuff, you see the purity in which they are born, the willingness they have to play with people, and the laughter and the trust they have in their caregivers. And also how sponge like they are. They will take in whatever they're given. Whatever you present with them with will be the normal.
Mhm.
And then when I see like a young baby or a young child, and then you see, you hear these cases of horrible serial killers and murderers and rapists, and there is a path from that to this. And you kind of think, well, that's obviously it's a horrible path, which has turned that person, that sponge, into this.
Mhm.
And I honestly think that anyone who spends any sustained period of time around young children and thinks that humans are inherently evil is odd. I can't imagine how you would think that.
Yeah.
Um,
It's so true about seeing the innocence, and back to what you're saying at the start, the awe that children have of the world, the wonder,
mm,
the fact that they are a sponge, and thinking of those criminals as once being that young, innocent sponge is pretty interesting. It really challenges, I think, our innate desire to be like, oh, they're a villain or they're cruel. And I mean, that's
yeah.
the
And
whole.
of course, parenting, since I'm a philosopher, so I reflect on anything. But since becoming a parent as well, it's raised up a whole new array of philosophical issues.
Mhm.
In fact, if I go back to university, I think I want to study like the philosophy of parenting, particularly of fatherhood, actually. But there's a book called The Carpenter and the Gardener, and this idea that there's very thin line between, as a parent, between bringing up your child, making them a certain way, and letting them grow as a certain way. So we were talking about earlier
Mhm.
about that kids are sponges and they are witnessing what you say. And on the basic level, it's kind of like use your knife and fork and don't fart and burp in public. These aren't rules that we teach them. We don't just let them grow up and assume they're going to work out. But then at the same time, we also want them to play and work out their own kind of way in life and stuff. So there's a very fine line between that. And
Mhm.
ethics is a really interesting area of that, isn't it? Like what is right and wrong? Because I think, is it Lawrence Kohlberg, who's a psychologist, who said, there's this moral development theory that kids at a very young age are essentially they'll only do right or wrong because of their fear of reward and punishment,
Mhm.
and eventually will internalize and create these kind of moral codes that we live by. But in that stage, you have to essentially establish and model what is good and bad. And seeing morals and ethics in that kind of psychological terms kind of, I think, makes me feel a lot more favorable towards like rehabilitation programs rather than just like pure punishment.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, this is the philosophy of punishment. Now we're going to philosophy of punishment. Now, you know, how much is punishment kind of like a deterrence? How much is it for rehabilitation? How much is it protection of the majority who are left outside of prisons?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, it's a bit of both, and every country has to decide where it places the balance on it.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, Scandinavian countries place more emphasis on rehabilitation, and a lot of countries place the deterrent. Any country which has the death penalty obviously see death, the punishment, as being a deterrent. And I think punishment does act as a deterrent to some people. Like if you didn't have prison, if you only promised them rehabilitation, I think they know that. I think there probably would be some increase in some certain kinds of crimes.
Mm-hmm.
But as you said earlier, I don't think anyone harms people without being harmed themselves. So I think kind of healing the person would be, be the best way forward. About 3 or 4 years ago, we were burgled.
Oh no!
In our house, as we were sleeping in our house. Obviously, it's quite traumatic at the time. You kind of think someone's coming into your personal space. It's very invasive, and you feel like you've been kind of like intruders in your space, personal space. Luckily, no one was hurt, and no one, And in the grand scheme of things, the person who stole that stuff is probably much more broken and unhappy than we were as a result of it. So,
So, panpsychism. That's a concept that when I came across it in your book, that was only, I think, the second time I had read that word. And the first time I heard it, I didn't really grasp it. And then I read it in your book and I was like, oh, okay, this is more interesting. And since then, it's just come up and up and up. And now I've dove into it more. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. And if you could explain to listeners, what is panpsychism?
Wow. Okay. Thank you. Hard ask, because panpsychism is essentially it's a family of philosophies. Mm-hmm. But the broad claim is that panpsychism is that consciousness is some kind of fundamental feature of the universe. That everything has some kind of consciousness. It starts with essentially the claim that consciousness exists, that you have a consciousness, I have a consciousness. And yet we can't say much more about it than that. We don't know where consciousness comes from. We don't even really know how it operates in the world. We don't know how the mind affects the body. So how can we make sense of that? And an Australian philosopher called David Chalmers, who's this very charismatic and very articulate philosopher, he argues that consciousness is something which exists like a fundamental force of the universe. So we have these fundamental forces like gravity, like weak and strong nuclear energy, nuclear force, and electromagnetism. And these are unexplained and forces which don't have anything below them, and yet they occupy every scientific equation that we know of. Mm-hmm. So consciousness is like that, he says. It might exist as a thing in the universe. We can't explain it, but we know it exists. And so from there, Chalmers then builds up a whole theory known as panpsychism, which is the idea he thinks that consciousness is something which is proportional to information exchange, information processing. So that's what happens in your brain, for example. There's synapses are constantly working together. They're passing information all the time. You are now listening to my voice, which is going into your brain, which is processing whatever. But also everything has some kind of information exchange. So two particles, when they're joined together, will be swapping data of some sort. And so Chalmers argues that anything with a degree of sophisticated information exchange will have a degree of consciousness. I think he says that it has to be a little bit above kind of subatomic stuff, but eventually, ants and things will have some kind of degree of consciousness, and mice and rats will have some degree of consciousness. I think most people are happy with saying that maybe dogs or the higher primates and things have some degree of a mind. But we're not happy with saying things like rocks have a consciousness, or that the waves have a consciousness. So that's the basic claim, that consciousness exists. We can't explain it. So it exists like a fundamental force. And then we can build up these kind of rules or equations about how consciousness emerges.
In your book, you say Chalmers, like the name of the chapters is Chalmers on the Thoughts of Pencils.
Yes.
So it is definitely weird to think about pencils having thoughts or rocks having thoughts. And all of this reminds me of quantum theory, which is way too much to get into today. I can barely even explain it myself. However, looking at how everything is connected, and if everything is connected by these subatomic particles, then do those particles in and of themselves have consciousness? And if they do, then technically everything does, but not to the extent that we do. But we also don't have consciousness to the extent that, I don't know, mushrooms do. Like mushrooms have an entire world underneath our grass, our dirt, that covers the entire planet, in their whole system, like a communication network. And there's intelligence there that we can barely understand. So we could say that they have consciousness that is beyond us too, or plants that can make their own food. We can't make our own food. We have to go to the grocery store.
Yeah, 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 exactly.
So, yeah.
Well, yeah. So do you know what? I mean, little secret here. Panpsychism and consciousness and philosophy generally has kind of led me on a slightly spiritual journey,
Mm.
taking a completely different look. Like, because the basic idea is that our particles, our atoms, will come together in a certain combination to create my brain, which create my thoughts and create my life. That without my thoughts, there is no me. And a long time ago, I read Friedrich Nietzsche, this idea of eternal recurrence. And this is the idea that eventually your life will come back around, that everything about the universe will happen again. And Nietzsche kind of like presented it as a thought experiment to explore his idea of amor fati, which is the idea of love your faith. But I actually, it's an article of faith, but I'm not a religious person. I don't subscribe necessarily to the big major religions. But I like this idea that if the universe is infinite, or even nearly infinite, but hugely large, infinitely large. Let's say infinite for just argument's sake. There's going to be an infinite combination of particles and hitting each other, coming together. And so when I die, my particles will obviously kind of dissolve away, and I'll become the trees, I'll become the grass, whatever my family will do with me. They might burn me and atomize me. Fine, they can do that. But then eventually, given enough time, the infinite monkeys of infinite typewriters, my particles will come together as a zygote in my mother, in the exact same world, in the exact same universe as I am already. And therefore the life will happen again. And I will grow up and I'll have the same thoughts, the same family, and the same ideas, and I'll meet the same people, have the same kids as I have now. I quite like that idea. And it's an article of faith, because basically the faith point is we don't know if the universe is infinite. But if the universe is infinite, then yes, we will have everything will come around again. And I quite like that idea.
Interesting. I like that. It's a different spin on reincarnation. That's very
because
cool.
it's the same life, isn't it? But of course, the corollary, if that is that there is a version of me with one, less hair on the back of my head, but that wouldn't be me, and that'd be a different universe. So would it have the same thoughts? Then maybe I need to think about it more. But that's I'm in the early stages of being a panpsychist.
That's awesome. It reminds me of multiverse theory almost, right? That there's you in a different dimension reliving your same life. Because obviously you couldn't relive the same life in this dimension. That wouldn't make sense. People would be like, oh, there he is again.
No, I love those ideas. When I was growing up, there was a program called Quantum Leap, which is the idea that you could jump into different kind of like similar-ish.
Yes.
I love those kind of like ideas anyway. Like, the what if situations. What if the world was, what if trees were purple?
To wrap up, Johnny, I'd love to know, how would you encourage listeners to embody the mind of a philosopher in their day-to-day lives? Because I feel like philosophy, when people think of it, tend to think of the old guy in a chair with a spectacle and really just having all the time in the world to contemplate. But that's not how we live our lives. So how could a listener take that spectacle with them every day?
Wow, that's a good question. It's a really good question. And it's something I'm trying to work on more in my kind of future, where the space I want to move into. And it's all to do about kind of, I think, good conversations, about kind of going past the boring conversations about the weather, how your family doing, how's the job, I'm not saying that's necessary. Those conversations are necessary because it's security, it's a comfort blanket, and also it's emphatic language. It builds relationships, it builds emotion with each other. But having the bravery and the courage to kind of talk about stuff which is beyond the boring stuff. And I genuinely believe that most people, if you give a conversation that space, the conversation will eventually fall into some kind of philosophy. I often call it the 2 a.m. chats. And when I say it, I sound like I'm endorsing alcoholism. I'm not. But what I'm saying is that a lot of people might relate to the idea that if you've been to a party, a dinner party, or you've been to a pub or whatever, or you're walking home with a friend after a big night out, and it's 2 a.m., you're a little bit tipsy, had a beer, there's something about the world, and it's all very quiet. And suddenly the conversations are of a very different order to the ones you had at the start of the night. And, that implies to me that the conversations are there. And it doesn't have to be a conversation with another person. That's what philosophy can be. Introspective. It can be a conversation with yourself. And that's, asking, these big questions like, what is truth? Do you believe in God? What is it, right or wrong? And stuff, what is beautiful and stuff. These are big kind of questions. You don't have to approach them with those questions. In fact, there's loads of different ways you could tackle them. But I think don't be afraid to talk about those issues. So essentially, I would argue that kind of don't be boring. Maybe I think, and if you adopt that mantra about most things, I think you'll eventually fall into some kind of philosophy. Just don't be boring, and I think there'll be something emerging out of it. this Thelma idea, which is debatable whether it's, you know, inherent, intrinsic, genetic, or whether it's kind of like taught to you. I think that idea is, have more interesting conversations.
Yeah. So don't be afraid to go deeper. Don't be boring. Don't play it safe, I guess, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what's the worst happened? I mean, I like to ask kind of deep questions, personal, introspective, and also philosophical questions. And I think 99 times out of 100, most people really relish the opportunity. The conversations are richer, more enjoyable, and I think fuller for it. You know, one time in 100, someone will say to me that I don't want to talk about that, go away, and it's a slightly frosty atmosphere, and then the conversation will probably end there. But I'm okay with that. I'm willing to risk the 1% to get the 99% better, personally. And of course, all of my friends in life know what I'm like. And in fact, I probably choose my friends on the basis of their willingness to kind of like to go beyond the froth, talking about the weather. It is a risk for people you don't entirely know, but I would argue it's a risk worth taking.
Thank you so much, Johnny, for being with us today. I so appreciate you sharing your insights. And this was definitely not a boring conversation.
Oh, thank you very much. I enjoy it. As always, I love just talking, and I found out more about myself in the process. So thank you for the questions, and thank you for the opportunity. Really.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much for listening. If you're enjoying the podcast, I invite you to participate in a Growth Zone challenge. I invite you to take a moment, a second, a gap in your day right now and share this episode with 2 other people. Thank you for minding the gaps with me. I'll see you next time on the journey out of our comfort zones and into our growth zones.